Earth's seat stayed empty. Because the galaxy remembered why humans bow to no one. The throne room had stood empty for 300 years, and the galaxy had learned to stop asking why. Ambassador Vex Thalarin of the Kethrai Dominion stood before that empty seat now, his 4 eyes narrowing at the dust that had gathered on armrests carved from a mineral no scanner could identify. Behind him, 12 delegations from 12 star nations waited in silence, their breathing apparatus hissing softly in the vast chamber. They had come to claim it. Today, finally, someone would sit on the sovereign's throne of the old human compact, abandoned since the Great Silence, and whoever sat there would inherit the ancient authority that still made lesser fleets pause. At system borders out of habit, no one quite remembered anymore. Vex reached out one clawed hand toward the seat. The lights in the chamber died, not flickered. Died, all at once, as if something had reached across the room and closed its fist around the very concept of illumination. Then, in the dark, a voice spoke, calm, almost bored, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "That's not yours to sit in." When the lights returned, the ambassador's honor guard were on the floor, weapons scattered, unconscious but breathing. Standing beside the throne, one hand resting casually on its carved back, was a woman in a faded gray coat, no older than 40, with tired eyes and a service pistol she hadn't even bothered to draw. Every alien in that room felt something they hadn't felt in 3 centuries, fear that remembered its source. 6 days earlier, none of this had begun in a throne room. It began in a supply depot on the edge of nowhere, on a rusted mining platform called Kestrel Reach, where Mara Voss was arguing with a vending machine about the price of instant noodles. Mara wasn't important. That was the whole point. She'd spent 11 years hauling ore between the outer belts, flying a ship, held together with stubbornness and duct tape, answering to no government because no government had bothered to claim the Reach. She had a daughter back on the agricultural moon of Tessup, a habit of talking to her dead co-pilot's photograph, and absolutely no idea that she was about to become the single most discussed individual in galactic history. That changed when the Kethrai warships arrived. 3 of them, sleek and violet, dropping out of transit space with the kind of arrogance that only came from species who'd never lost a war. Their broadcast hit every channel on the Reach simultaneously, translated into 40 human dialects by an AI that clearly hadn't bothered to check its grammar. Attention, insignificant colony. This system has been identified as bordering the Forbidden Expanse. By decree of the Kethrai Dominion, all residents will evacuate within 1 hour, or be classified as trespassers upon sovereign silence. Nobody on Kestrel Reach knew what the Forbidden Expanse was. Nobody had ever needed to know. It was just empty space, marked on old star charts, with a border no one crossed, enforced by nothing anyone could see, respected out of ancient superstition passed down for so many generations that its origin had become legend. But the Kethrai knew something the miners didn't. They knew whose territory it actually was, and they had come to test whether anyone was still guarding it. Vex Thalarin, then merely a fleet commander, and not yet an ambassador, watched from his flagship bridge as terrified miners scrambled toward their transport ships. This was the 11th such border test his people had conducted this year. 10 times, nothing had happened. 10 times, they had pushed the line a little further, claimed a little more territory, grown a little bolder. The Kethrai were not cruel by nature. They were pragmatic, ambitious, and utterly convinced that the old warnings about human space were exactly what every other species had already decided they were. A fossilized myth, a ghost story told by a civilization that had died out or fled, or simply stopped caring, leaving behind empty borders and empty thrones and no one left to enforce either. Vex intended to prove it, once and for all, but he had overlooked one crucial detail. Mara Voss's ship wouldn't start. It was almost funny, in the darkly absurd way that disasters often are. 43 minutes into the hour-long evacuation window, with every other vessel already breaking orbit, Mara's engine coughed, sputtered, and died, leaving her stranded on the platform with her daughter's stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand. She'd come back for it, of all things, some irrational instinct that a mother would understand, and no one else would question. and 17 minutes left before the deadline that would make her, officially, a trespasser upon sovereign silence. She didn't know that phrase meant execution under Kethrai law. She found out when the first drone descended through the shattered dome of the platform's atrium, red optic sensors sweeping the wreckage, weapon systems already priming with a whine that made her back hit the wall of a collapsed noodle stand. Everything changed in the next few seconds. The drone never fired. It simply stopped, mid-motion, hovering, then dropped to the floor with a metallic clatter, as dead as if someone had reached out and switched it off from the inside. Mara stared at it, heart hammering, waiting for the follow-up strike that never came. Instead, a comm channel opened, uninvited, overriding every frequency on the platform, including the Kethrai command net 600 kilometers away. "Fleet Commander Thalarin," said a voice, unhurried, almost gentle. "You have 41 seconds to recall your drones before I consider this a hostile act, rather than a misunderstanding." Vex Thalarin, who had commanded warships through 3 border conflicts and never once flinched, felt something ancient and reptilian coil in his gut. "Identify yourself," he demanded. "You already know who I am," the voice said. "You just didn't believe it was still true." The truth stunned the entire galaxy, though it would take days for anyone to understand why. The recall order went out, the drones withdrew, and on the mining platform, Mara Voss watched as a single figure materialized from what looked like nothing. Not teleportation, not stealth armor deactivating, but something stranger, as though space itself had simply agreed to stop hiding him. He was an old man, unremarkable in appearance, wearing a coat as faded as hers, with the kind of tired eyes that belonged to someone who had seen too much and slept too little. "You're going to be fine," he told her, kneeling to retrieve the stuffed rabbit that had fallen from her hand. "Go home to your daughter." "Who?" Mara's voice cracked. "Who are you?" The old man smiled, and there was something impossibly sad in it. "Somebody who's been keeping a promise for a very long time." Nobody knew what the human was hiding, not even the ones who'd sworn to protect it. His name, the galaxy would eventually learn, was Elias Grant, and he was the last of the compact Sentinel Order. An institution so old that even the Kethrai's most exhaustive historical archives contained only fragments about its purpose. 300 years ago, when the human compact had fractured under wars no history book agreed upon, when its capital worlds burned and its fleets scattered and its people vanished into the dark corners of the galaxy to rebuild quietly, unnoticed, the Sentinel Order had made a choice. They would not restore the Empire. They would not raise a new throne. They would simply watch, and wait, and make certain that whatever humanity became next, it would inherit a galaxy where its old borders still meant something. Not through fear alone, but through the certainty that someone remembered how to enforce them. There had been 30 Sentinels once. Then 12. Then 3. Now there was 1. Elias Grant was 81 years old, and he had spent 60 of those years alone, drifting the forbidden expanse in a ship that predated every warship in known space, holding a line that no government asked him to hold, and no government could have stopped him from holding. The Council had made a terrible mistake, and they were only beginning to realize it. The Kethrai Dominion convened an emergency session within hours. Ambassador, soon to be former Ambassador, Thalarin argued that this was a bluff, a relic-playing theater, that the Dominion's combined fleet could erase this Sentinel with one coordinated strike. The Dominion's eldest counselor, a weathered creature named Serral Dune, who had survived 4 wars, listened with visible exhaustion. "Do you know why our ancestors marked that border, Vex? Not out of respect. Out of arithmetic. 3 centuries ago, a battle group of 40 ships crossed that line to test the same theory you tested last week. And 2 came out," she said. "The survivors described 1 man, 1 ship, and a peace they begged us never to break again." The room went silent, and in that silence, something worse than fear took hold. Understanding. But politics rarely listens to old wisdom, and ambition rarely respects arithmetic. A faction within the Dominion, hungry for the mineral wealth long rumored to lie within the expanse, pushed forward anyway. Not with warships this time, but with something crueler. They took hostages. 41 miners from 3 different colonies, Mara Voss among them, herded onto a prison transport and broadcast across every channel in the sector with a single demand: surrender the throne's authority, or watch them die. It was, Vex Thalarin would later admit, the single greatest miscalculation in Kethrai history. Because Elias Grant did not negotiate. He boarded that prison transport alone, unarmed by any weapon a scanner could detect, walking through 3 security checkpoints that simply stopped functioning as he passed. Past guards who found themselves inexplicably unable to raise their weapons, until he stood in the holding bay, where Mara Voss and 40 others waited in terrified silence. "I'm sorry it took me this long," he told them. And there were tears in his eyes, an old man's grief for every soul he hadn't reached in 60 years of solitary vigilance. "I'm not as fast as I used to be." The Queen suddenly froze, for the Dominion's ruling matriarch, watching remotely from her palace, saw something in that old man's face that no strategic briefing had prepared her for. Not a weapon, not a warrior, a father apologizing to strangers because he had decided, 60 years ago, that they were his to protect. What happened next was never fully explained by any official record, because Elias Grant refused to explain it himself, and every witness described it differently. Some said the ship's hull simply opened like a flower. Some said gravity itself bent around him like a bowed head. What everyone agreed on was this: 41 hostages walked free, untouched, and the prison transport's crew surrendered without a single shot fired. Some of them weeping, unable to articulate why. That wasn't even the biggest surprise. The biggest surprise came 6 days later when Elias Grant, exhausted, aging, carrying 60 years of solitary duty in his bones, walked into that ancient throne room not to claim the seat, but to formally, finally, retire. "I kept the promise," he told the assembled delegations, his voice raw. "I held the line until someone worth handing it to came along." He looked at Mara Voss, standing awkwardly at the back of the crowd, still clutching her daughter's rabbit, wondering why she'd been summoned at all. "You didn't run," he said to her. "You went back for something you loved, even when it cost you everything. That's not weakness. That's the entire reason this throne was ever worth guarding." The council had made a terrible mistake once. This time, no one dared repeat it. Mara Voss did not sit in that throne. She refused it gently, insisting she was a cargo pilot, not a sovereign, and that the galaxy, strangely, unexpectedly, respected her more for the refusal than they would have for acceptance. Instead, something new was born from that empty room. Not an empire reborn, but a promise renewed, a small order of ordinary people who chose freely to stand where Elias Grant could no longer stand alone. Elias himself lived another 4 years, teaching them everything 60 years of solitude had taught him, before he passed peacefully, surrounded by people who called him grandfather, though not one drop of blood connected them. The throne remained empty, it always would. Because the galaxy finally understood what the Kethrai had learned in blood 3 centuries before: humanity's power was never the empty seat, and never the ancient authority carved into its armrests. It was the ordinary person who chose to stand beside it, unarmed, exhausted, and unwilling to leave anyone behind. Years later, children on Kestrel Reach grew up hearing the story told 100 different ways, each version a little taller than the last. But the ones who had actually been there, the 41 who walked off that prison transport alive, never needed the embellishments. They remembered it plainly. An old man in a faded coat, apologizing for being late, and a woman who went back for a stuffed rabbit, because love does not pause to calculate risk. Mara Voss kept flying cargo runs long after the galaxy learned her name, refusing every offer of rank or title that came her way. "Somebody has to keep hauling ore," she'd say. "Turns out that's still me." And on quiet nights, when the expanse lay dark and undisturbed, those who listened closely swore they could still feel it. Not a throne, not an empire, but a promise kept.